Sometimes the most dangerous people in a room are the ones you'd never suspect. They sit quietly in the corner booth, order their meal politely, and smile at the waitress. They look like your neighbor, your colleague, or the friendly woman at the grocery store. But beneath that calm exterior lies years of training that most people can't even imagine. What happens when ordinary criminals pick the wrong target? What happens when they mistake kindness for weakness and silence for vulnerability? Sometimes the predator becomes the prey in ways they never saw coming. This is the true story of Sarah Chun, a woman whose quiet dinner turned into a life-changing moment that would remind everyone present that heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes they wear civilian clothes and order chicken parmesan. Sarah Chun had been looking forward to this evening for weeks. After 6 months of deployment in the Mediterranean, followed by endless debriefings and paperwork at Naval Special Warfare Command, she finally had what every Navy SEAL craved most: a completely ordinary evening with nowhere to be and nothing to prove. She chose Romano's Italian restaurant not because it was fancy, but because it was the opposite. The small family-owned establishment on the outskirts of Virginia Beach served generous portions, played soft jazz music, and, most importantly, didn't ask questions. The owner, Tony Romano, treated every customer like family without prying into their personal lives. For someone who spent her professional life in situations where every word mattered and every detail could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure, Romano's offered something precious: anonymity. Sarah had changed out of her service uniform hours ago, trading the crisp navy blue for a simple black sweater and jeans. Her dark hair, usually pulled back in a regulation bun, fell loosely around her shoulders. She wore minimal makeup and carried herself with the relaxed posture of someone enjoying a rare moment of peace. To anyone watching, she looked like a typical young professional unwinding after a long day at the office. The restaurant was moderately busy for a Tuesday evening. An elderly couple shared dessert near the window while discussing their grandchildren's upcoming visit. A group of college students occupied a corner table, their conversation peppered with laughter and complaints about upcoming exams. A businessman sat alone at the bar, occasionally glancing at his phone between bites of lasagna. The atmosphere was exactly what Sarah had hoped for: comfortable, unremarkable, and blissfully normal. She ordered the chicken parmesan without looking at the menu. It had been her go-to meal at Romano's for the past 3 years, ever since she'd first discovered the place during her initial training at Naval Amphibious Base Little Creek. Back then, she was just another naval officer trying to prove herself worthy of the SEAL program. The physical demands had been brutal, the mental challenges even more so, but somehow she'd found solace in these quiet dinners, these moments of normalcy that reminded her why she was fighting so hard for something bigger than herself. The waitress, Maria, brought her a glass of water and a basket of warm bread. Sarah had seen her many times before, but they'd never exchanged more than pleasantries. Maria was probably in her 50s with kind eyes and the efficient movements of someone who'd been serving tables for decades. She treated Sarah with the same friendly professionalism she showed all customers, never showing curiosity about why a young woman dined alone so regularly, or why she sometimes appeared to be nursing injuries that she brushed off as gym accidents. As Sarah broke off a piece of bread and buttered it slowly, she allowed her mind to wander to the events of the past few months. The mission in the Mediterranean had been classified, like most of her work, but it had tested every skill she'd developed over her 7-year career. Intelligence gathering, underwater demolition, close-quarters combat, emergency medical procedures. All had been required in a single operation that lasted less than 72 hours, but felt like a lifetime. She joined the Navy at 18, driven by a combination of patriotic duty and a desire to prove that her small stature and quiet demeanor didn't define her capabilities. At 5'4" and 125 pounds, she'd been underestimated her entire life. High school counselors had suggested administrative careers. College professors had questioned her decision to major in criminal justice. Even some of her initial Navy instructors had doubted whether she possessed the physical and mental toughness required for special operations. They'd all been wrong. The SEAL training had been the most difficult experience of her life, but also the most transformative. She learned that true strength wasn't about size or volume, but about determination, intelligence, and the ability to remain calm under pressure that would break most people. She'd mastered skills that most people only saw in movies: advanced marksmanship, underwater navigation, parachute operations, hand-to-hand combat, explosives handling, and tactical medicine. More importantly, she learned to trust her instincts completely. In her line of work, intuition often meant the difference between coming home and becoming a casualty. She developed an almost supernatural awareness of her surroundings, an ability to read people and situations with startling accuracy, which is why she noticed the three men when they first entered Romanos. They didn't belong, not in an obvious way. They weren't carrying weapons or acting overtly suspicious, but something about their behavior triggered the mental alarms that years of training had embedded in Sarah's consciousness. They moved with the artificial casualness of people trying too hard to appear relaxed. Their eyes swept the restaurant with the systematic thoroughness of individuals conducting reconnaissance rather than customers looking for a table. The first man was tall and lean, probably in his mid-30s, with the pale complexion of someone who spent most of his time indoors. He wore an expensive leather jacket that didn't quite hide the nervous energy in his movements. The second was shorter and stockier, with numerous tattoos visible on his forearms and the scarred knuckles of someone familiar with violence. The third appeared to be the youngest, maybe early 20s, but he carried himself with the jumpy alertness of someone under the influence of stimulants. Sarah continued eating her bread, maintaining the appearance of a woman lost in her own thoughts, while actually cataloging every detail about the newcomers. They chose a table with a clear view of the restaurant's main dining area and positioned themselves so each could watch different sections of the room. The tall one kept glancing toward the kitchen and the rear exit. The stocky one focused on the front entrance and the bar area. The young one seemed to be watching the other customers, his eyes lingering on purses, jewelry, and phones left visible on tables. Professional criminals, Sarah realized, probably planning to rob the restaurant. She felt a familiar coolness settle over her mind, the same mental state that had carried her through countless dangerous situations. Her breathing remained steady, her posture relaxed, but internally she was already running through contingency plans. How many customers were present who might be at risk? What weapons might be available if the situation escalated? What were the optimal exit routes? How could she neutralize 3 suspects with minimal collateral damage? The men ordered coffee and appetizers, clearly stalling for time while they finalized their plan. Sarah noticed them checking their watches frequently and exchanging meaningful glances. They were waiting for something, probably a signal from an accomplice outside, or perhaps for the restaurant to empty out further. Maria brought Sarah's chicken parmesan, and she thanked the waitress with a genuine smile, while silently hoping the older woman wouldn't get caught in whatever was about to happen. The dish was perfectly prepared, as always, but Sarah barely tasted it. All of her attention was focused on the three men and their increasingly agitated behavior. The tall one answered his phone briefly, spoke in whispers, then hung up with what appeared to be satisfaction. He nodded to his companions, and Sarah saw them all take deep breaths, preparing themselves for action. The moment she'd been anticipating was about to arrive. She considered her options. The smart move would be to alert the authorities and evacuate the premises. She could discreetly contact local police, identify herself as military personnel, and request immediate backup. Standard protocol for civilians encountering criminal activity was to avoid engagement whenever possible. But Sarah wasn't a standard civilian, and several factors complicated the situation. First, she was unarmed except for the small tactical knife she always carried, a habit so ingrained that she felt naked without it. Second, calling for backup would take time, and these men looked ready to move immediately. Third, there were at least 15 innocent people in the restaurant, including elderly customers and college students who would be terrified and unpredictable in a crisis situation. Most importantly, Sarah had taken an oath to protect American citizens from all enemies, foreign and domestic. These three men represented a clear and immediate threat to innocent people. She wasn't about to hide behind her civilian clothes while others were placed in danger. The tall man stood up and stretched, a casual movement that Sarah recognized as a final signal. The other two finished their coffee and pushed back their chairs. All three were positioning themselves for coordinated action. Sarah took another bite of her chicken parmesan and reached for her water glass with steady hands. To anyone watching, she remained a young woman enjoying a quiet dinner, completely unaware of the danger developing around her. In reality, she was a highly trained special operations warrior preparing for battle. The first rule of combat that every SEAL learned was the importance of controlling the initial engagement. Whoever acted first with maximum aggression and complete commitment usually determined the outcome of the entire encounter. Sarah had no intention of waiting to become a victim. She finished chewing her food, took a sip of water, and prepared to show three would-be criminals the difference between predator and prey. The attack began exactly as Sarah had predicted it would. The tall man approached the elderly couple by the window, his hand moving inside his jacket in a gesture that was unmistakably threatening. The stocky man headed toward the college students, pulling out what appeared to be a large knife. The youngest criminal moved toward the bar area, producing a handgun that he held low against his leg, trying to keep it concealed from the other customers. "Nobody move," the tall man shouted, his voice cracking slightly with adrenaline. "This is a robbery. Everyone stay calm, and nobody gets hurt." The restaurant erupted into chaos. The elderly woman by the window let out a sharp gasp and clutched her husband's arm. The college students froze mid-conversation, their faces draining of color as they stared at the knife pointed in their direction. The businessman at the bar started to reach for his phone, but stopped when he noticed the gun. Sarah remained perfectly still, her hand resting casually beside her water glass. She appeared to be just another terrified customer, but her mind was racing through tactical calculations. Three suspects, armed with at least one firearm and one blade. Approximately 15 civilians in various states of panic. Multiple exit points, but all currently covered by the suspects. Standard robbery protocol suggested they demand cash from the register and valuables from customers before making their escape. But something felt wrong. Professional robbers didn't typically operate with this much manpower for such a small target. Romano's was a modest family restaurant, not a high-end establishment likely to yield significant cash returns. The men's nervous energy suggested inexperience, but their coordination indicated planning. Most troubling of all, they seemed more interested in controlling the customers than in actually taking money. "You," the tall man said, pointing at Tony Romano behind the counter, "open the register." Now, Tony, a heavy-set man in his 60s who'd been running the restaurant for over 20 years, moved slowly toward the cash register. His hands shook as he fumbled with the keys, and Sarah could see the genuine fear in his eyes. Tony had always been kind to her, treating her with the warmth of a protective uncle, never asking questions about her unusual schedule or the occasional injuries she tried to hide. "Hurry up," the stocky man barked, waving his knife menacingly at the college students. "And everyone else, phones on the table. Right now." The customers began complying, placing their devices on their tables with trembling hands. Sarah slowly reached for her phone, but instead of placing it on the table, she held it in her lap and quickly typed a text message to 911, providing the restaurant's address and a brief description of the situation. She managed to hit send just as the youngest criminal noticed her movement. "Hey," he said, pointing his gun in her direction. "I said phones on the table." Sarah looked up at him with what appeared to be confusion and fear. "I'm sorry," she said softly, her voice carrying just the right note of submission. I am scared." The young man stepped closer to her table, his weapon now clearly visible to the other customers, who responded with fresh waves of panic. Sarah could smell the chemical odor of methamphetamine on his breath and clothes, which explained his jittery behavior and dilated pupils. Drug-fueled criminals were particularly dangerous because they were unpredictable and often immune to pain that would stop a sober person. "Stand up," he ordered, gesturing with a gun. "Move over there with the others." Sarah rose from her chair with apparent reluctance, her movements slow and submissive. She kept her hands visible and her body language non-threatening, playing the role of a frightened civilian perfectly. But as she stood, she shifted her weight slightly, positioning her feet in a stance that would allow for explosive movement when the opportunity presented itself. The criminal was now less than 3 feet away from her, well within the range where Sarah's training gave her decisive advantages. His gun was pointed in her direction, but not aimed with precision, a common mistake made by inexperienced criminals who relied on the psychological impact of the weapon rather than proper tactical positioning. "Please," Sarah said, her voice trembling convincingly, "I just want to go home." The young man smirked, clearly enjoying the power he held over someone he perceived as helpless. "You'll go home when we're done here," he said. "Now move." That was his first mistake. In the specialized world of military combat, there are certain distances that separate life from death. Within arm's reach, a trained fighter has multiple options for disarming an opponent, even one holding a firearm. Sarah had spent hundreds of hours practicing these techniques, first in controlled training environments and later in real-world situations where failure meant death. The young criminal had moved well inside the critical distance, and his attention was focused on intimidating her rather than maintaining tactical awareness. His gun hand was extended but not braced. His stance was casual rather than defensive, and his eyes were fixed on her face instead of scanning for threats. Sarah moved with the explosive speed that had been drilled into her through years of training. Her left hand shot up and grabbed the criminal's wrist, controlling the weapon and directing it away from herself and the other customers. Simultaneously, her right hand struck upward into his elbow joint, hyperextending the arm and causing him to cry out in pain and surprise. The gun discharged once into the ceiling, the sound deafeningly loud in the confined space, but the weapon was already spinning out of his grip. Before the young man could react to losing his firearm, Sarah's knee drove upward into his solar plexus, doubling him over and driving the air from his lungs. She followed immediately with an elbow strike to the back of his neck, a blow calculated to incapacitate without causing permanent damage. The entire sequence took less than 3 seconds. The criminal collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath and clutching his throat. The gun skittered across the tile floor, coming to rest near the elderly couple's table. The restaurant erupted into fresh chaos as the other 2 criminals realized their partner was down. The tall man spun away from the cash register, his hand emerging from his jacket with what appeared to be a pistol of his own. The stocky man abandoned his position near the college students and started moving towards Sarah, his knife held in a threatening grip. "What the hell?" the tall man shouted. "Who are you?" Sarah didn't answer immediately. She was busy calculating her next moves, assessing the new tactical situation. 2 armed suspects remaining, one with a firearm and one with a blade. The gun was the priority threat, but the man with the knife was closer and moving faster. She kicked the fallen criminal's gun further away from his reach, then grabbed a chair from a nearby table. The wooden chair was solid and heavy, perfect for her purposes. The stocky man reached her first, swinging his knife in a wide arc that would have been devastating against an untrained opponent. But Sarah had faced knife-wielding enemies before, in dark alleys in foreign cities where the stakes were much higher than a restaurant robbery. She caught the blade on the chair's wooden back, the knife embedding itself in the hardwood. Before her attacker could pull it free, Sarah twisted the chair violently, wrenching the weapon from his grip and sending it clattering across the floor. The stocky man stared at his empty hand in shock, apparently unable to process how quickly he'd been disarmed. Sarah didn't give him time to adapt. She swung the chair in a controlled arc, the wooden seat connecting with his ribs and sending him stumbling backward into an empty table. The tall man, meanwhile, had finally managed to draw his weapon, an older model revolver that looked like it had seen better days. But his hands were shaking with adrenaline and fear, and he was clearly struggling to understand how a situation that should have been under his complete control had turned so dramatically against him. "Stop right there," he yelled, pointing the gun at Sarah. "I'll shoot you." Sarah set down the chair and raised her hands, but her posture remained balanced and ready. She was still several feet away from him, too far for the disarming techniques that had worked on his younger accomplice, but close enough to see the uncertainty in his eyes. "You don't want to do that," she said calmly, her voice carrying a quiet authority that seemed to penetrate the chaos around them. "Think about what happens next." The tall man's gun hand wavered slightly. Sarah could see him trying to process the situation. His 2 partners were down, the robbery had failed completely, and he was facing a woman who had just demonstrated combat skills he couldn't begin to understand. "Who are you?" he demanded again. "Someone you don't want to fight," Sarah replied. The stocky man was struggling to get back to his feet, one hand pressed to his ribs where the chair had connected. The youngest criminal was still on the ground, breathing heavily but showing signs of recovery. The situation remained dangerous. 2 of the 3 suspects were still potentially capable of continued resistance. Sarah heard sirens in the distance, growing louder by the second. Her text message to 911 had apparently been received and acted upon quickly. Local law enforcement would arrive within minutes, which changed her tactical priorities. Her goal now was to maintain control of the situation until professional backup arrived. The tall man seemed to hear the sirens too, and desperation replaced some of the uncertainty in his eyes. Cornered criminals were often the most dangerous kind, particularly when they realized their escape routes were disappearing. "This is your fault," he shouted at Sarah, his gun hand steadying with renewed purpose. "You ruined everything." Sarah could see his finger tightening on the trigger and knew she had seconds before he fired. The range was too great for a direct physical assault, but there were other options available to someone with her training and experience. Romano's Italian restaurant had become a combat zone, but the real battle was just beginning. The elderly man by the window suddenly stood up, his face flushed with anger rather than fear. "You boys picked the wrong place to cause trouble," he said in a strong voice that carried clearly across the restaurant. "You have no idea who you're messing with." The tall man spun toward the elderly customer, momentarily distracted by this unexpected show of defiance. Sarah saw her opportunity and took it. She dove forward and to the side, rolling behind an overturned table just as the gun discharged. The bullet splintered wood inches from where her head had been. Before the tall man could fire again, Sarah was moving, using her cover to close the distance between them. The stocky criminal had regained his feet and was looking around frantically for another weapon. The youngest suspect was trying to crawl toward the exit, still gasping from Sarah's strikes, but determined to escape before police arrived. The sirens were very close now, probably less than a block away. Sarah knew she only needed to maintain control for another minute or two before professional help arrived. But a minute was a lifetime when facing armed opponents who had nothing left to lose. The tall man fired again, his shot going wide as he struggled to track Sarah's movement between the tables and chairs. She could hear him cursing as he realized his revolver probably held only 1 or 2 more rounds. Sarah reached the counter area where Tony Romano was crouched behind the register. The older man looked at her with a mixture of amazement and concern. "Are you hurt?" she asked quickly. Tony shook his head. "Who are you?" he whispered. "Someone who doesn't like bullies," Sarah replied, then peered around the counter to assess the tactical situation. The tall man had lost sight of her and was backing toward the front exit, his gun sweeping back and forth as he searched for targets. The stocky man had found a steak knife from one of the tables and was also moving toward the door. The youngest criminal had made it to his feet, but was swaying unsteadily. Police cars were pulling into the parking lot, their flashing lights visible through the restaurant's windows. The 3 criminals could see them too, and Sarah watched their body language shift from aggression to panic. Cornered animals were always the most dangerous, and these 3 still represented a significant threat to the innocent people in Romano's. Sarah knew she had one more move to make before this was over. She stood up from behind the counter, her hands visible, but her stance radiating controlled confidence. "It's over," she announced loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Police are here. Put down your weapons." The tall man spun toward her voice, his gun rising to target her position. But this time, Sarah was ready with a response he hadn't anticipated. The dining room of Romano's Italian restaurant was about to witness the final lesson in why criminals should never underestimate quiet women who eat alone. The final confrontation lasted less than 10 seconds, but for everyone present, it seemed to unfold in slow motion. As the tall man's gun swung toward her, Sarah was already moving. She grabbed a full bottle of olive oil from the counter and hurled it with precision that came from years of weapons training. The heavy glass bottle struck the criminal's wrist with enough force to deflect his aim and cause him to drop the revolver, which clattered across the floor toward the front entrance. Before he could recover, Sarah vaulted over the counter with fluid grace and closed the distance between them in 3 quick strides. The tall man was reaching for his fallen weapon when Sarah's foot connected with his solar plexus, doubling him over and sending him crashing into a nearby chair. The stocky criminal with the steak knife made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation. He lunged toward the nearest table of customers, the college students who had been frozen with terror throughout the entire ordeal. Sarah couldn't reach him in time to prevent the attack, but she didn't need to. The elderly man by the window had picked up the young criminal's dropped pistol and was holding it with the steady grip of someone who knew exactly how to use firearms. "That's far enough, son," he said calmly, his voice carrying unmistakable authority. The stocky man froze mid-lunge, suddenly, realizing he was facing someone who wasn't intimidated by his knife. The restaurant's front door burst open as Virginia Beach police officers flooded into the dining room, their weapons drawn and their commands echoing off the walls. "Police! Nobody move! Hands where we can see them!" Sarah immediately raised her hands above her head and stepped away from the fallen criminals, making herself clearly visible to the responding officers. The elderly man carefully placed the pistol on his table and also raised his hands. The other customers remained in their positions, most still too shocked to fully process what had just happened. "3 suspects down," Sarah called out clearly. "One weapon secure by the customer at table 6. I'm unarmed." The lead officer, a veteran sergeant named Martinez, whom Sarah recognized from previous encounters in her civilian life, took in the scene with experienced eyes. 3 criminals were on the ground in various states of injury and defeat. A restaurant full of customers appeared shaken, but unharmed. And in the center of it all stood a young woman in casual clothes who was speaking with the calm professionalism of someone accustomed to tactical situations. "Ma'am, step back, please," Martinez instructed, though his tone was more curious than suspicious. Something about Sarah's demeanor suggested she wasn't just another civilian who'd gotten lucky. The 3 criminals were quickly secured and searched for additional weapons. The young one was still having trouble breathing from Sarah's initial strikes, but was coherent enough to complain loudly about police brutality. The stocky man had what appeared to be bruised ribs, but no serious injuries. The tall man was conscious, but seemed dazed from his encounter with the olive oil bottle and Sarah's kick. As paramedics examined the suspects and checked on the customers, Detective Lisa Wong arrived to begin preliminary interviews. Wong had been working robbery cases in Virginia Beach for over a decade and had seen her share of unusual situations, but this one was already shaping up to be memorable. "Can you tell me your name, ma'am?" Wong asked Sarah, her notepad ready. "Sarah Chun," came the reply. "And your occupation?" Sarah hesitated for just a moment. Her military service was a matter of public record, but her specific assignment within Naval Special Warfare was classified. "I'm with the U.S. Navy," she said simply. Detective Wong's eyebrows rose slightly. That explained the woman's unusual composure and apparent combat training, but it raised new questions about what exactly had transpired in Romanos. "Were you injured during the incident?" Wong continued. "No, ma'am. I'm Fina. Can you walk me through what happened?" Sarah provided a concise, factual account of the evening's events, from her observation of the suspect's suspicious behavior through the final moments when police arrived. Her description was precise and detailed, delivered with the kind of objective clarity that impressed experienced investigators. Meanwhile, other officers were interviewing the remaining customers and restaurant staff. The stories they told painted a picture that seemed almost too extraordinary to believe. A quiet woman eating dinner alone had somehow managed to disarm and defeat 3 armed criminals with her bare hands, preventing what could have been a tragedy. The elderly man by the window, who introduced himself as retired Marine Colonel James Patterson, was particularly eager to share his perspective with anyone who would listen. "I served 2 tours in Vietnam, and Another in Desert Storm, Colonel Patterson told Detective Wong. I've seen plenty of combat in my day, but what that young lady did tonight was something special. She moved like a professional, smooth, controlled, no wasted motion. Those boys had no idea what they were getting into when they walked through that door. Tony Romano, despite still being shaken by the night's events, was equally impressed. Sarah's been coming here for years, he told the investigators. Always quiet, always polite, never any trouble. I had no idea she was, well, whatever she is. She saved my restaurant tonight, probably saved all our lives. The college students were still processing their experience, but their account corroborated Sarah's version of events. One of them had managed to capture part of the confrontation on his phone, providing video evidence of Sarah's remarkable skills. Maria, the waitress who had served Sarah her chicken parmesan, was perhaps the most amazed of all the witnesses. She just sat there eating her dinner like nothing was wrong, she told Detective Wong. Even when those men came in, she seemed so calm. I thought she was scared like the rest of us, but now I realize she was planning something. As the initial interviews concluded and the suspects were transported to jail, Detective Wong found herself with more questions than answers. The three criminals had been carrying fake identification and weren't talking beyond demanding lawyers. Their weapons were unregistered, and their rental car contained materials suggesting they'd been planning multiple robberies throughout the area. This wasn't their first job, Wong explained to Sarah as they spoke privately near the restaurant's entrance. We think they've been hitting small businesses all along the coast. You probably prevented a lot more crime than just tonight's robbery. Sarah nodded, but didn't seem particularly interested in praise. Is everyone okay? She asked. The customers, the staff, anyone hurt? Just some bruised ribs on the stocky guy, and the young one might have a mild concussion from whatever you did to his neck. Both will be fine. Everyone else is shaken up, but physically unharmed. Good, Sarah said simply. Detective Wong studied the young Navy officer for a moment. Can I ask what your specific role is in the military? I'm not able to discuss the details of my assignment, Sarah replied. But I can say that de-escalating dangerous situations is part of my training. Wong nodded, understanding that she'd reached the limits of what she could learn about Sarah's background. Military personnel, particularly those in special operations roles, often couldn't discuss their work in detail. Well, whatever your job is, the Navy trained you well, Wong said. You probably saved lives tonight. As the official investigation continued and the restaurant slowly returned to normal, an interesting dynamic began to emerge among the witnesses. Rather than being traumatized by the violence they'd experienced, most of the customers seemed energized by having witnessed something extraordinary. The college students were already crafting social media posts about their brush with a real-life action hero. Colonel Patterson was regaling anyone who'd listen with stories about the exceptional warriors he'd encountered during his military career. Even Tony Romano seemed more excited than upset, already planning how he'd tell the story to future customers. Sarah, meanwhile, just wanted to finish her dinner. She'd answered all of Detective Wong's questions, provided her contact information for any follow-up interviews, and given a formal statement about the evening's events. The restaurant was still technically a crime scene, but investigators had cleared her to retrieve her personal belongings from her table. Her chicken parmesan was cold by now, but Sarah sat down and took another bite anyway. Romano's had been her refuge from the pressures of her military life, and she wasn't about to let three amateur criminals change that. Maria approached her table tentatively. Can I get you something fresh from the kitchen? She asked. On the house, of course. Sarah smiled, the first completely genuine expression of emotion she'd shown since the ordeal began. The chicken parmesan is fine, she said. I've eaten plenty of cold MREs in my time. This is still better than most of my dinners." As Sarah ate, other customers began approaching her table, not to bother her with questions or requests for selfies, but simply to express their gratitude. The elderly couple stopped by to thank her for protecting them. The college students wanted her to know how brave she'd been. The businessman from the bar offered to pay for her meal. Each interaction was brief and respectful, but the cumulative effect was something Sarah hadn't expected. Throughout her military career, her heroic actions have been classified, invisible to the civilian world she protected. Tonight was the first time ordinary citizens had witnessed what she did for a living, even if they didn't fully understand it. Colonel Patterson was the last to approach her table. He moved with the careful dignity of a man whose joints have been punished by decades of military service. But his eyes were bright with recognition and respect. "I wanted to shake your hand," he said simply, extending his weathered palm. "Whatever unit you're with, they should be proud." Sarah stood and accepted the handshake. "Thank you, sir." "No," Patterson said firmly. "Thank you for your service and for tonight." As the colonel walked away, Sarah realized that something fundamental had changed about her relationship with Romano's Italian restaurant. It would never again be the anonymous refuge it had been before. Tony, Maria, and the regular customers would always remember her as the quiet Navy officer who'd saved them from armed criminals. But perhaps that wasn't entirely bad. Sarah had spent her entire adult life protecting people who never knew her name or understood the sacrifices she made on their behalf. Tonight, for the first time, she'd been able to help people who could actually see and appreciate what she'd done for them. Detective Wong stopped by her table one final time before leaving the scene. "We'll need you to come to the station tomorrow to sign your formal statement," she said. "And there will probably be media interest in this story. Are you prepared for that?" Sarah considered the question carefully. Military personnel were generally discouraged from seeking publicity, and her special operations background made her particularly wary of unwanted attention. But she also understood that tonight's events would be impossible to keep quiet. "I'll cooperate with whatever the investigation requires," she said. "As for media attention, I'd prefer to keep that to a minimum." Wong nodded understandingly. "I'll do what I can to keep your name out of the headlines, but the story is going to get out. 3 armed robbers taken down by a woman eating dinner alone. That's the kind of thing that goes viral these days." As the evening wound down and the restaurant finally emptied of police officers and investigators, Sarah found herself alone with Tony Romano. The owner had been cleaning up the overturned chairs and broken glass, trying to restore his establishment to its normal appearance. "I owe you everything," Tony said as Sarah prepared to leave. "My restaurant, maybe my life. You saved it all tonight." "You don't owe me anything," Sarah replied. "I just did what anyone would do." Tony shook his head emphatically. "No, that's not true. Most people would have hidden under the table, called 911, and hoped for the best. You put yourself in danger to protect strangers. That's not what anyone would do. That's what heroes do." Sarah felt uncomfortable with the label, but didn't argue. She left Romano's that night, knowing that her quiet dinner routine had been permanently altered, but also with a deep sense of satisfaction that she'd been able to use her training to protect innocent people. The story of what happened at Romano's Italian restaurant spread quickly through Virginia Beach and eventually reached national news outlets. While Detective Wong managed to keep Sarah's full identity confidential, the basic facts were too compelling to ignore. Video footage from the college student's phone, combined with witness testimonies, provided undeniable evidence of one woman's extraordinary response to a dangerous situation. Sarah received commendations from her naval command, grateful letters from the customers she'd protected, and interview requests from news organizations around the country. She declined most of the media attention, preferring to let her actions speak for themselves. But she did return to Romano's the following week for her usual Tuesday night dinner. Tony seated her at the same table. Maria brought her the same chicken parmesan, and the atmosphere was exactly as welcoming as it had always been. The only difference was the small, framed newspaper clipping that Tony had hung behind the cash register, with the headline, "Local Hero Stops Armed Robbery." He'd placed it right next to the photo of his family and the certificate from the Virginia Beach Chamber of Commerce. Sarah noticed it, but didn't comment. Some battles were worth fighting, and some recognition was worth accepting. As she ate her dinner in the comfortable normalcy of Romano's, Sarah reflected on the strange turns that life could take. She joined the military to serve her country in distant places against foreign threats. She'd never expected to use her skills to protect a family restaurant in her hometown. But perhaps that was exactly what her training was really for. Not just the dramatic overseas missions that made headlines, but the quiet moments when ordinary citizens needed someone willing to stand between them and danger. Outside Romano's, life in Virginia Beach continued its normal rhythm. But inside the small Italian restaurant, everyone who'd been present that Tuesday night carried with them a new understanding of the extraordinary people who walk among us, protecting others while asking for nothing in return. Sarah Chun finished her chicken parmesan, left her usual tip, and walked out into the night. Tomorrow she'd return to her classified duties and her invisible service to the nation. Tonight, she was simply a woman who'd reminded the world that heroes don't always wear uniforms and strength doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one you'd never suspect, and sometimes that's exactly who you want on your side.